The complete history of the planes is not a tale of distant worlds, but of the very architecture of reality itself, forged in cosmic fire before the first mortal drew breath. Before gods claimed their thrones and demons waged eternal war, existence separated into realms of pure elemental chaos, divine law, and infinite shadow. Each plane became a reflection of absolute truth, where concepts like good and evil, order and chaos ceased to be ideas and became living worlds. Yet the planes were never meant to remain divided. Ancient conflicts tore holes between realities, and beings older than the gods themselves still move through the spaces where one realm bleeds into another. What happened when reality first split apart, and what will happen when those borders finally collapse? The separation began not with intention but with necessity. Reality could not sustain its own formless infinity. The primal stuff of existence began to stratify, according to principles that operated beneath consciousness itself. The first division created the fundamental architecture that all later cosmologies would inherit. Dense elemental matter collapsed inward, forming the foundation of what would become the inner planes. Pure conceptual essence drifted outward, creating the scaffolding for the outer planes. Between these extremes, transitional spaces emerged where the laws governing each domain could blend and transform. This was not creation in the sense mortals would later understand it. This was differentiation, the multiverse discovering its own internal structure through a process that resembled geological formation more than divine craftsmanship. The inner planes solidified first because they dealt in the most fundamental aspects of physical reality. Fire separated from water. Earth found its opposite in air. Each element claimed a discrete domain where its nature could express itself without interference. These were not abstract concepts, but actual places where the substance of fire burned without fuel and the essence of water flowed without containment. The boundaries between these elemental realms remained permeable at first. Where fire met water, vast regions of steam and transformation came into being. Where earth touched air, endless storms of dust and stone whirled through spaces that had no true ground. The elemental chaos, as it would later be named, was the consequence of this incomplete separation. It was the borderland where elements fought for dominance, and no single force could claim absolute authority. Within the elemental chaos, the first conscious beings emerged. These were not gods in any sense that mortals would recognize. They were primordials, entities whose existence was synonymous with elemental force itself. Each primordial embodied aspects of creation and destruction that operated on scales incomprehensible to lesser minds. They shaped reality through their mere presence, and their conflicts reshaped continents that did not yet exist on material worlds. The primordials did not conceive of themselves as builders or destroyers. They simply were, and reality bent to accommodate their existence. Their wars were not fought over territory or resources, but over fundamental questions of what reality should be allowed to become. The energy released by these primordial conflicts created ripples that extended beyond the inner planes. Where primordial fire clashed with primordial ice, the released force did not simply dissipate. It traveled outward, carrying with it the imprint of consciousness and will. This energy accumulated in the spaces between the inner and outer planes, forming vast repositories of potential that would later become crucial to the structure of the multiverse. The astral plane began to take shape not as a place but as a medium, a silver void where thought moved faster than matter and where distance became a function of mental focus rather than physical space. The astral was the first transitional realm, and its formation marked a crucial threshold in planar development. The outer planes crystallized more slowly because they dealt in concepts rather than substances. While the inner planes were forged from elemental building blocks, the outer planes required the existence of consciousness to give them form. They needed thought, belief, and moral reasoning to establish the frameworks that would define their nature. The earliest outer planes existed as vague potentials, spaces that contained the possibility of law and chaos, good and evil, but lacked the definition that would make these concepts into distinct realms. They waited for the forces that would carve them into their final forms. Those forces arrived with the emergence of the gods. Unlike the primordials, who were elemental and unconscious in their fundamental nature, the gods possessed intention and personality. They looked upon the formless potential of the outer planes and saw the opportunity to create realms that reflected their own values and philosophies. The exact origin of these divine beings remained a subject of theological debate even among the gods themselves. Some claim to have emerged spontaneously from the same primal forces that created the primordials. Others suggested they were born from the first stirrings of mortal consciousness on worlds that were only beginning to support life. What mattered more than their origin was their impact on the structure of reality itself. The gods began to shape the outer planes according to their alignments and portfolios. Celestia rose as a mountain of 7 heavens, where law and goodness found their perfect expression. Each layer represented a further refinement of these principles, ascending from the relative accessibility of Lunia to the transcendent light of Cronius. Opposite Celestia in moral and philosophical orientation, the abyss opened as an infinite series of layers where chaos and evil manifested in endless variety. Each layer of the abyss was a unique nightmare, shaped by demon lords who ruled through strength and cunning. Between these extremes, other outer planes came into being. Arborea celebrated freedom and passion. Mechanus embodied perfect law without moral judgment. The grey waste stretched between evil alignments as a place of apathy and despair. The process of divine shaping was not peaceful. Gods contested with each other over the fundamental nature of reality. These were not wars in the traditional sense, but conflicts over cosmic architecture. When Asmodeus led his forces into the deepest regions of the lower planes, he was not conquering territory but redefining what evil could mean when filtered through law rather than chaos. The 9 hells took shape as his armies carved order into the formless malevolence that had existed before their arrival. Each of the 9 layers became a reflection of different aspects of lawful evil, from the contested wasteland of Avernus to the frozen tyranny of Cania, to the ultimate depths of Nessus, where Asmodeus himself held court. The transformation of these spaces from potential into actuality required immense effort and the willing sacrifice of countless lesser beings who were remade in the process. The formation of the outer planes created new problems that reality had not previously encountered. The planes existed, but they had no organizing principle to connect them. A god dwelling in Celestia had no clear path to interact with forces in Arborea or Mechanus. Mortals who began to populate the material plane found that their souls had nowhere to go when their bodies failed. The cosmology required connective tissue, infrastructure that would allow movement and interaction between realms that operated on fundamentally different principles. The solution emerged in multiple forms. The astral plane, already existing as a transitional medium between inner and outer realities, expanded its function. It became the silver void through which souls traveled after death, drifting toward the outer planes that matched their alignment and beliefs. Gods could traverse the astral to reach different parts of the outer planes. Mortal spellcasters who achieved sufficient power discovered that the astral offered paths that bypassed normal spatial limitations. The astral sea, as it came to be known in some cosmological frameworks, was infinite and timeless. Objects did not decay there. Travelers did not age. The psychic projection of thought created color pools that served as portals to specific planes and locations. Another transitional realm formed below and between the planes. The ethereal plane emerged as a misty border that overlapped with the material plane and extended its influence toward the inner planes. Creatures could exist simultaneously in the material and ethereal, perceiving both realities as ghostly overlays. The deep ethereal extended far from any material world, touching the borders of the inner planes and creating opportunities for travel between elemental realms. Unlike the astral, which was empty and thought-responsive, the ethereal was filled with its own strange ecology. Creatures native to the border realm hunted in the mists. Demiplanes formed as bubbles of isolated reality within the ethereal substance. With the basic architecture of the multiverse established, the forces that inhabited these realms began to interact in ways that would define ages of cosmic history. The blood war erupted as the eternal conflict between the lawful evil devils of the nine hells and the chaotic evil demons of the abyss. This was not a war over territory or resources. Both sides possessed infinite space within their home planes. The conflict was philosophical and existential. Devils fought to prove that evil was most effective when organized and controlled. Demons fought to demonstrate that true evil required absolute freedom and the destruction of all restraint. The war raged across the lower planes, with both sides committing vast armies to battles that reshaped entire layers of reality. The blood war had consequences far beyond its participants. The battlefields required neutral ground where neither side held absolute advantage. The Grey Waste served this function, its three gloom-shrouded layers becoming the primary theater of an eternal conflict. Yugoloth mercenaries offered their services to both sides, prolonging the war and ensuring that neither devils nor demons could achieve decisive victory. The war also created a shield that protected the upper planes and even the material plane from the full attention of the lower planes. Devils and demons expended their energy fighting each other rather than launching coordinated assaults on realms of good or mortal worlds. Some celestial strategists quietly acknowledged that the Blood War's continuation served purposes beyond the immediate participants' intentions. While the Blood War consumed the lower planes, a different kind of conflict shaped the relationship between gods and primordials. The Dawn War began when primordials looked upon the work the gods had done in shaping the outer planes and creating mortal life on material worlds. The primordials saw this as an affront to the natural chaos and elemental freedom that should have remained dominant. They resolved to unmake what the gods had built, to return reality to its earlier state of pure elemental flux. The primordials possessed advantages in this conflict. They commanded the fundamental forces of reality itself. Their power over elemental matter exceeded anything the gods could marshal. When primordials attacked, they did not send armies but reshaped continents and rewrote the laws governing physical existence. The gods responded by doing what primordials could not. They inspired, they created, they elevated mortal beings into divine servants who could fight with the passion and adaptability that eternal beings often lacked. The Dawn War was fought across multiple planes, simultaneously. On the material plane, continents shattered under the assault of primordial fury. Mortal civilizations that had barely begun to form were swept away by tidal waves of elemental destruction. In the elemental chaos, gods led expeditions deep into territory the primordials considered their own. Celestial armies clashed with elemental titans in battles that created permanent scars in the substance of the planes themselves. The turning point came not through military victory, but through a fundamental shift in the nature of reality. The gods bound the primordials using chains forged from concepts rather than matter. They imprisoned the most dangerous primordials in locations that existed between planes, in dimensional pockets where elemental fury could rage without threatening the stability of the wider multiverse. Some primordials were slain, their essence scattered across the planes where it cooled into mountains or evaporated into storms. Others were bound into service, their power harnessed to maintain the very structures they had sought to destroy. The most cunning primordials retreated deep into the elemental chaos, accepting an uneasy truce rather than face annihilation. The conclusion of the Dawn War established divine supremacy over the structure of the multiverse. Gods claimed the right to shape mortal destiny and planar development. They established divine realms within the outer planes, spaces that served as both homes and expressions of their power. These divine domains were not simply locations but extensions of the gods themselves. When mortals entered the realm of a deity, they experienced that god's nature directly. The fields of Elysium reflected the pastoral peace of nature gods. The forges of Celestia rang with the work of creation deities. The war halls of Ysgard echoed with the battle lust of combat gods. These divine realms became the ultimate destination for mortal souls who had served the gods faithfully in life. The post-war settlement required rules to prevent future conflicts from destroying everything the gods had built. This need created the Overgod, though whether the overgod was created by necessity or had always existed above and beyond normal divinity remained a mystery even to the gods themselves. In the crystal sphere containing the world of Toril and its surrounding planar connections, the overgod known as Ao established laws that bound all deities. Gods could not manifest directly on the material plane without expending tremendous energy. They could not slay each other without consequences. They required mortal worship to maintain their power and position. These restrictions frustrated many deities, but they also created the stability necessary for mortal civilizations to develop without constant divine interference. The establishment of divine law created unintended consequences. Gods began to compete for mortal worship rather than for planar territory. Pantheons formed and fractured as deities, made alliances or declared rivalries. Some gods sought to expand their portfolios, claiming domain over concepts and forces that other deities had previously controlled. These divine conflicts rarely erupted into open warfare because Ao's laws made such conflicts costly. Instead, gods fought through mortal proxies, granting power to champions who would advance divine agendas in the material plane. This created a permanent connection between mortal activity and planar politics. Every prayer, every temple, every act of faith sent ripples through the planes. Mortal response to the existence of the planes varied dramatically across cultures and ages. Early civilizations perceived the planes as distant realms accessible only through death or the most powerful magic. They built their cosmologies around practical concerns. Where did souls go after death? How could priests channel divine power? What happened when elementals manifested in the material world? These questions led to the development of planar magic, spellcasting traditions that specialized in crossing boundaries between realities. The first planar mages were as much explorers as wizards, venturing into unknown realms and returning with knowledge that reshaped mortal understanding of the multiverse. These early explorations revealed that the planes were not static. They shifted and evolved in response to forces both internal and external. New demiplanes formed spontaneously when enough magical energy concentrated in a single location. Existing planes expanded or contracted as the balance between alignments and elements shifted. Gods moved their divine realms from one plane to another, sometimes peacefully and sometimes through conflict with other deities. The planes themselves seemed to possess a kind of living responsiveness, adapting to the needs and nature of their inhabitants while maintaining their fundamental character. The discovery of Sigil transformed planar exploration from isolated ventures into a coherent culture. Sigil, the city of doors, existed at the center of the Outlands, the neutral plane that served as a hub connecting all the outer planes. The city's nature defied normal planar logic. It was shaped like a torus, curving up and over itself so that residents could look up and see the city stretching above them in all directions. Gravity pointed toward the outer edge of the ring, creating a space where up and down became relative rather than absolute. More importantly, Sigil contained portals to everywhere. Every arch, every doorway, every gap in a wall had the potential to serve as a gateway to another plane if one possessed the right key. The ruler of Sigil was the Lady of Pain, an entity whose nature and purpose remained enigmatic even to gods. The lady appeared as a floating humanoid figure whose face was obscured by blades that radiated from her head like a deadly crown. She never spoke. She never explained her actions or intentions. She simply enforced two absolute rules. First, no gods could enter Sigil. Any deity who attempted to breach the city found themselves flayed by the lady's mere presence, their divine essence scattered and their consciousness trapped in infinite pain. Second, anyone who worshipped the Lady of Pain was marked for death. Cults that formed around her image were discovered and eliminated by the lady's maze, a pocket dimension of infinite corridors where the condemned wandered until madness or death claimed them. Sigil's existence created opportunities that had not previously been possible. Merchants established trade routes that spanned multiple planes. A trader could purchase elemental crystals in the plane of Earth, transport them through Sigil to Celestia, and sell them to archons who needed materials from the inner planes. Scholars from across the multiverse gathered in Sigil's libraries, comparing notes on planar geography and magical theory. Factions formed, organizations dedicated to particular philosophical interpretations of the multiverse's meaning and structure. The Harmonium sought to impose order across all planes. The Zalcitecs embraced chaos as the ultimate truth. The Athar denied the divinity of gods, claiming they were simply powerful beings unworthy of worship. These factions competed for influence in Sigil, while using the city as a base for operations that extended across the planes. The faction culture in Sigil reflected deeper questions about the planes themselves. What did it mean that reality was organized along moral and philosophical lines? Did the existence of planes dedicated to good or evil prove that these concepts were objective rather than subjective? Could one change the nature of a plane through sufficient effort and belief? The factions proposed different answers. The believers of the source claimed that all beings were slowly ascending toward ultimate unity with the planes themselves. The Doomguard argued that entropy was the only true constant and that all planes would eventually collapse into uniform decay. The Sign of One proposed that each individual created their own reality and that the planes were simply reflections of collective consciousness. While Sigil served as the hub for planar culture, other locations developed their own significance. The city of Brass floated in the Plane of Fire, a metropolis of Efreet merchants and slaves where anything could be bought if one survived the heat long enough to negotiate. The Iron City of Dis stood on the second layer of the Nine Hells, its metal walls containing the bureaucratic machinery that administrated diabolical contracts across the multiverse. Tunarath, the fortress city of the Githyanki, drifted through the astral plane, built on the corpse of a dead god whose body provided foundation and resources for the militant planar raiders who called it home. Each of these locations represented a different approach to planar existence. The Efreet of the city of Brass treated the planes as resources, to be exploited and controlled. The Devils of Dis saw the planes as territories in an eternal game of power and influence. The Githyanki of Tunarath viewed the planes as hunting grounds where they could raid for treasure and slaves while avoiding the Mind Flayer empire they had escaped millennia before. These perspectives created complex webs of alliance and enmity that transcended simple alignment categories. Lawful evil devils sometimes traded with chaotic good Eladrin. Neutral merchants from Sigil negotiated contracts with demon lords of the Abyss. The planes themselves continued to evolve in response to the actions of their inhabitants. The Beastlands grew more wild as primal gods invested power in preserving nature in its most untamed form. Mechanus became more ordered as Modrons refined the mathematical principles underlying their existence. The Abyss spawned new layers as demon lords competed for territory and power, each creating a personal hell that reflected their particular brand of chaotic evil. These changes were not arbitrary. They followed patterns that planar scholars could study and sometimes predict. The planes responded to concentrated belief and action. A sufficient number of souls arriving in a particular plane with similar values could shift that plane's nature incrementally. Gods who expanded their worship base found their divine realms growing more influential. This responsiveness created a form of planar ecology, where different forces competed for dominance not through violence but through cultural and magical influence. Celestials launched campaigns to redeem fiends, believing that even devils and demons could be turned toward good if exposed to sufficient divine grace. Some of these redemption efforts succeeded, creating rare examples of reformed fiends who settled in the upper planes. More often, they failed spectacularly, with the Celestials involved corrupted or destroyed. Fiends, for their part, worked constantly to extend their influence into the material plane and other realms, viewing corruption as both a goal and a proof of their philosophy's superiority. The material plane occupied a unique position in this planar ecology. It was the primary source of mortal souls, which served as the currency of planar power. Every soul that arrived in the afterlife added to the strength of the plane and gods that claimed it. This created intense competition among deities for mortal worship. Gods offered their followers power, protection, and purpose, in exchange for faith and service. When mortals died, their souls traveled through the astral plane to the realm that best matched their alignment and beliefs. A lawful good paladin would ascend to Celestia, likely joining the armies of archons in their eternal struggle against evil. A chaotic evil murderer would descend to the abyss, becoming a main or other low-ranking demon. Not all souls found homes in the outer planes. Those who died with unfinished business sometimes became trapped in the ethereal plane as ghosts or other incorporeal undead. Souls of particularly powerful mortals occasionally achieved a different fate entirely. Some became divine servants, ascending to positions of power within the realms of gods they had served in life. Others transformed into outsiders, native creatures of whatever plane claimed them. A few souls achieved true apotheosis, ascending to godhood themselves through the worship of followers or by seizing divine power through extraordinary deeds. The possibility of mortal ascension to divine status created both opportunity and danger. Established gods viewed mortal aspirants with suspicion, understanding that every new deity represented competition for finite amounts of worship. Some gods actively worked to prevent mortals from achieving divinity, destroying promising candidates before they could complete their transformation. Other gods took the opposite approach, sponsoring mortal champions and guiding them toward apotheosis. These sponsored ascensions usually came with expectations. The new god was expected to serve the interests of their sponsor, effectively becoming a junior member of that deity's divine household. The most dramatic example of mortal ascension involved Cyric and Mystra during the Time of Troubles. The Time of Troubles began when Ao decided that the gods of Toril had become too distant from mortal concerns. They had forgotten that their power derived from worship rather than inherent divine nature. To teach this lesson, Ao cast all the gods down to the material plane, forcing them to walk among mortals in physical avatar form. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Magic became unpredictable as the goddess Mystra, who embodied the weave that channeled magical energy, was killed by Helm on Ao's orders when she tried to reach the heavens. Without Mystra maintaining the weave's stability, spells misfired or failed entirely. Gods who had never experienced mortality found themselves vulnerable to everything from disease to old age. Mortal adventurers found themselves in a unique position. They could confront gods directly, even slay them if sufficiently powerful and lucky. Two mortals, Cyric and Midnight, took advantage of this opportunity. They gathered the portfolios of dead gods, accumulating divine power while the celestial order remained disrupted. When Ao finally allowed the surviving gods to return to the planes, he required that every deity have a clear portfolio and an active mortal following. Cyric ascended as the god of murder, strife, and lies. Midnight became the new Mystra, taking on the crucial role of maintaining the weave. Their ascension proved that the boundary between mortal and divine was permeable under the right circumstances. The Time of Troubles had lasting effects on planar structure. Gods became more active in mortal affairs, understanding that neglecting their worshippers could result in divine death. The connection between divine deaths, the material plane, and the outer planes strengthened as deities invested more effort in maintaining their churches and supporting their followers. Planar travel became more common as both mortals and outsiders recognized that the barriers between realities were not as absolute as previously believed. These changes set the stage for the next major transformation in planar cosmology. That transformation began with the work of mortal arcanists who refused to accept the limits imposed by divine authority. The Empire of Netheril rose in ancient times on Toril as a civilization where magic replaced virtually every other form of technology and power. Netherese archwizards built flying cities that floated through the sky, sustained by magical engines of incredible complexity. They developed spells of such power that later ages could barely comprehend their function. They explored the planes not as supplicants seeking divine favor, but as conquerors claiming territory and resources. The Netherese approach to the planes was fundamentally different from religious traditions. They saw the outer planes not as homes of the gods, but as dimensions subject to the same natural laws that governed the material plane. If those laws could be understood, they could be manipulated. This philosophy led to one of the most catastrophic magical experiments in history. The archwizard Karsus created a spell designed to steal the power of Mystra herself, temporarily making him the god of magic. Karsus' enclave, his floating city, was the epicenter of this working. The spell succeeded for a single instant. Karsus became a god. In that instant, he experienced the full scope of Mystra's responsibilities. The weave was not simply a tool for channeling magic, but a fundamental structure that prevented magical energy from destroying reality. Maintaining it required constant attention and power beyond what any mortal could sustain. Karsus could not bear the weight. The weave collapsed. Every spell in the world failed simultaneously. Every floating city fell from the sky. Karsus died, his consciousness trapped in stone as a permanent monument to hubris. The fall of Netheril sent ripples through the planes. The weave's collapse created tears in the barriers between dimensions. Creatures from the planes flooded into the material plane through these rifts. Entire regions of Toril became infused with planar energy, transforming landscapes and populations. The Shadowvar, Netherese survivors who had fled to the plane of shadow during the Empire's height, found their refuge permanently altered. The plane of shadow, previously a dim reflection of the material plane, deepened into the Shadowfell, a realm of death and darkness that existed as a dark mirror to material reality. This transformation created a third major transitional plane alongside the astral and ethereal. The Shadowfell emerged as more than a refuge or passage. It became a destination in its own right, home to creatures born from negative energy and the fears of mortal minds. The Raven Queen claimed dominion over the Shadowfell, establishing her palace in the city of Letherna and taking on the role of psychopomp for souls lost or denied their proper place in the outer planes. Shadar Kai, elves who followed the Raven Queen into the Shadowfell, adapted to their new home by embracing emotion and sensation with desperate intensity to ward off the draining apathy of their environment. The Shadowfell influenced magic differently than other planes. Shadow magic drew on the realm's nature to create illusions and manipulations that straddled the boundary between real and unreal. Opposite the Shadowfell in nature and origin, the Feywild formed as a bright reflection of the material plane. Where the Shadowfell emphasized death and entropy, the Feywild celebrated life and transformation. It was a realm of endless summer and eternal autumn, where emotions manifested as weather and where promises held binding magical force. The Feywild had existed in nascent form long before the fall of Netheril, but the same planar disruptions that deepened the Shadow Plane also crystallized the Feywild into a fully realized dimension. Archfey ruled courts of summer and winter, competing through elaborate games and rituals rather than open warfare. Mortals who wandered into the Feywild found time moved differently. What seemed like a single night of revelry might represent years in the material plane. Those who ate Fey food or accepted Fey gifts often found themselves unable to leave, bound by magical obligation. These new transitional planes complicated the cosmological maps that planar scholars had developed over centuries. The traditional model, known as the Great Wheel, organized the planes in a ring structure. The 16 outer planes formed the rim of the wheel, arranged by alignment. The outlands occupied the hub, a neutral plane that touched all the others. The inner planes existed separately, accessible through the ethereal plane. The material plane sat at the wheel's center, the prime reality from which all others could be accessed. This model had served well for ages, providing a clear framework for understanding planar relationships. The emergence of the Shadowfell and Feywild as major planes rather than mere demiplanes required cosmologists to revise their models. Some scholars proposed expanding the Great Wheel to include these new transitional realms. Others suggested that the traditional model had always been incomplete, an approximation of relationships that were more complex than any two-dimensional diagram could represent. The debate grew more urgent as planar travel became increasingly common and as the interactions between planes grew more frequent and consequential. The cosmological debate was settled not through scholarship but through divine intervention. The gods reorganized the planes themselves, reshaping the fundamental architecture of reality. This restructuring, later called the world axis cosmology, represented a radical departure from the Great Wheel model. In the world axis, the astral sea became the dominant transitional realm, containing the divine realms that had previously existed as separate outer planes. The elemental chaos replaced the distinct inner planes, returning to a model closer to the primordial state before elemental separation. The Shadowfell and Feywild were elevated to equal status with the astral sea and elemental chaos as the four fundamental planes beyond the material. This reorganization was not purely philosophical. It reflected actual changes in planar structure that resulted from a series of catastrophes and divine conflicts. The spell plague that followed the murder of Mystra by Cyric and Shah tore through the planes like a dimensional earthquake. Magic stopped working, according to familiar rules. The boundaries between planes became dangerously thin. Entire sections of the material plane were transported to other dimensions. Parts of Toril found themselves merged with the world of Abare, its twin planet that had been separated since the earliest ages. These mergers created regions where planar boundaries effectively ceased to exist, where elemental chaos bled directly into material reality. The gods responded to the spell plague by fortifying their domains in the astral sea. Divine realms that had previously existed as separate planes coalesced into a more unified structure. Celestia, Arborea, and the other upper planes were transformed from distinct dimensions into dominions within the astral sea. This provided greater stability and made it more difficult for planar catastrophes to cascade across all of reality. The elemental chaos became more dangerous and more powerful, expanding its influence as the neat divisions between elemental planes dissolved. Primordials who had slept since the Dawn War began to stir, sensing opportunity in the cosmic disruption. Not everyone accepted these changes as permanent or even real. Planar purists argued that the world axis cosmology was a temporary aberration caused by the spell plague rather than a fundamental restructuring of reality. They pointed out that the Great Wheel had existed for far longer and reflected more accurately the moral and elemental organization of the planes. The debate carried practical implications. Navigation techniques that worked in a Great Wheel cosmology failed in a world axis structure. Spells designed to contact specific planes produced unpredictable results when the target plane no longer existed in the expected form. Priests found their prayers answered differently as divine realms shifted location and nature. The resolution came through the Sundering, a series of events that returned Toril to a state closer to its pre-spell plague condition, while preserving some of the changes wrought by divine reorganization. The weave was restored and stabilized. Abare and Toril were separated once more. The returned goddess, Mystra, worked to repair the damage that had accumulated over a century of magical chaos. Significantly for planar cosmology, the Sundering returned the Great Wheel as the dominant model, while acknowledging that the world axis structure also existed simultaneously. Different planes could be reached through either cosmological framework depending on the approach and magic used. A cleric channeling divine power might find themselves in the world axis version of the planes, while a wizard using arcane transportation could arrive in the Great Wheel equivalent of the same destination. This cosmological multiplicity, confusing as it initially appeared, eventually came to be understood as a feature rather than a bug. The planes had always been responsive to belief and perception. Different cultures and magical traditions had always described the planes in varying ways. The existence of multiple valid cosmological models simply made explicit what had always been implicit. Reality was vast enough to accommodate different organizational principles simultaneously. A paladin who believed their soul would ascend to Celestia after death would indeed arrive in that seven-layered mountain of goodness and law. A warlock who understood the planes through the world axis lens would find divine dominions floating in the astral sea. Both were correct because the planes existed in a state that transcended simple spatial relationships. This understanding transformed planar scholarship from a discipline focused on mapping fixed locations to one that explored the relationships between perception, belief, and reality. The most advanced planar theorists proposed that the planes had always existed in multiple configurations simultaneously. and that mortal minds simply lacked the ability to perceive this multiplicity directly. They pointed to Sigil as evidence for their theories. The City of Doors connected to both Great Wheel and World Axis cosmologies without contradiction because it existed outside both frameworks. The Lady of Pain, whatever her true nature, clearly operated according to principles that transcended the organizational schemes imposed by gods or scholars. The practical implications of planar multiplicity extended beyond philosophical debate. Adventurers discovered that the path to a specific location might vary depending on their expectations and magical approach. A portal keyed to the Great Wheel might deliver a traveler to a different version of their destination than a portal designed for world axis navigation. This created opportunities for those who learned to manipulate the ambiguity. Planar smugglers moved goods between different versions of the same plane, exploiting price differences and legal restrictions. Refugees from planar conflicts sometimes found sanctuary in cosmological corners that their enemies could not perceive or access. The planes themselves continued to evolve, regardless of which cosmological model observers preferred. The Blood War, intensified as the Spell Plague and Sundering, created opportunities for both devils and demons to expand their influence. The river Styx, which flowed through the lower planes connecting different layers of evil realms, became a more active battlefield as both sides sought control over this strategic waterway. Yugoloth mercenaries found themselves in higher demand than ever, able to command premium prices for their services as the war consumed more resources. In the upper planes, Celestials debated how to respond to increased fiendish activity. Some Archons and Angels argued for aggressive intervention, proposing crusades into the lower planes to strike at evil at its source. Others counseled patience and defense, noting that the Blood War continued to serve the strategic purpose of keeping devils and demons focused on each other rather than on other planes. The debate reflected deeper questions about the nature of good itself. Should good be passive, only defending against evil's incursions, or active, seeking to eliminate evil wherever it existed? Different celestial races and individual beings answered differently, creating divisions within the forces of good that mirrored in more benign form the eternal conflict between devils and demons. The inner planes, whether conceived as separate realms or as regions within the elemental chaos, remained largely indifferent to these moral and theological debates. Elementals concerned themselves with their fundamental natures. Fire burned, water flowed, earth endured, air scattered. The genies who ruled elemental domains engaged in their own complex politics that rarely intersected with the concerns of gods or mortals. The Jinn of the plane of air built palace cities in eternal clouds. The Tao of the plane of earth excavated treasure vaults in mountains of living gemstone. The Ifrit of the plane of fire expanded their mercantile empire, dealing in slaves and magical items across the multiverse. The Marids of the plane of water competed through elaborate games of status and prestige in their coral palaces. These elemental civilizations represented a form of planar culture fundamentally different from the alignment-driven societies of the outer planes. Genies possessed alignments, but their primary loyalty was to their elemental nature rather than abstract moral principles. A chaotic good genie had more in common with a lawful evil Tao, in terms of fundamental perspective, than either had with a celestial or fiend of matching alignment. This created unusual diplomatic situations when representatives from outer and inner planes attempted to negotiate. Each side literally came from a different framework of understanding reality. The plane of shadow, existing between life and death, light and darkness, occupied an unusual position in both cosmological models. As the shadow fell, it served as a gloomy reflection of the material plane, a place where death held dominion and where the boundary between living and undead became permeable. Necromancers found the Shadowfell particularly hospitable to their magic. The plane's nature made animating the dead easier and made undead creatures more powerful. The Raven Queen's rule prevented the Shadowfell from becoming a simple extension of the negative energy plane, imposing structure and purpose on what might otherwise have devolved into endless entropic decay. The Shadowfell's counterpart, the Feywild, expressed the opposite pole of existence. Where shadow emphasized endings, Fey celebrated beginnings. Where death ruled one realm, life without end dominated the other. The Feywild's eternal nature created its own problems. Without death as a natural conclusion, Fey existence became an endless cycle of repetition, modified only through elaborate games and rituals. The Archfey who ruled the various courts found themselves locked in patterns that had repeated for millennia. Only contact with mortals provided novelty, which explained the Fey fascination with luring mortals into their realm. Each mortal represented a spark of genuine change in a world that had become too stable. The relationship between these transitional planes and the material plane grew increasingly complex as magical practice evolved. Early spellcasters had treated planar travel as dangerous and rare, appropriate only for the most powerful wizards and clerics. By the modern era, planar travel had become merely difficult rather than impossible for mid-level adventurers. This democratization of planar access created new pressures on planar societies. Outer planes that had previously existed in relative isolation found themselves dealing with increasing numbers of mortal visitors. Some planes adapted by creating entry procedures and border controls. Others responded with hostility, attacking visitors on sight. Sigil's importance grew as the hub connecting these various approaches to planar travel. The city became not just a transit point, but a cultural melting pot where representatives of every plane could meet on neutral ground. The faction system that had dominated Sigil for ages collapsed and reformed several times as different philosophical movements competed for influence. The most recent iteration saw a reduced number of factions with more focused purposes. The Harmonium continued to promote law and order. The Revolutionary League worked to overthrow what it saw as corrupt power structures. The Transcendent Order pursued enlightenment through physical and mental discipline. These and other factions provided structure for mortal planar explorers while engaging in the philosophical debates that had always characterized Sigil's culture. The Lady of Pain remained the ultimate authority in Sigil, her presence ensuring that no god or other overwhelming power could dominate the city. Her motives remained unknown. Scholars proposed theories ranging from the benign to the sinister. Some suggested she was a fallen god who rejected divinity. Others claimed she was an incarnation of the planes themselves, a personification of the boundary between realities. A few whispered that she was an aberration from beyond the known planes, a creature whose nature was so alien that even gods could not comprehend her purpose. Whatever the truth, her consistent enforcement of Sigil's neutrality made the city indispensable to planar commerce and diplomacy. Outside Sigil, other planar metropolises developed their own cultures and purposes. The city of Union floated in the outlands near the Spire, serving as a gathering place for planners who preferred less supervision than Sigil offered. The Iron City of Dis continued to expand as the bureaucratic center of the Nine Hells, its metal towers processing the contracts that bound souls to eternal service. The city of Tradigate on the Outlands became a major trading hub, where merchants from across the plains exchanged goods without the restrictions imposed by Sigil's faction politics. Each of these cities represented different visions of how planar civilization could develop. The continued expansion of planar civilization created environmental pressures that the planes themselves began to respond to. Areas of the abyss that had been explored and mapped changed their configurations, spawning new layers or collapsing existing ones. The demons who called these layers home found themselves in constant competition, not just with each other, but with the realm itself. Only the strongest and most adaptable demons could maintain stable territories. This aligned perfectly with the abyss's nature as the ultimate expression of chaotic evil. The plane rewarded strength and cunning, while punishing weakness and stability. In contrast, Mechanus became more ordered and predictable. The Modrons, mechanical beings who embodied perfect law, expanded their great machine city of Regulus. They sent expeditions across the plains on regular cycles, attempting to measure and catalogue all of reality according to mathematical principles. These Modron marches became familiar sights on the outer planes, columns of geometric creatures processing from plane to plane in perfect formation. Most planars learned to avoid the marches rather than interfering with them. Modrons attacked anything that disrupted their progression, and their absolute dedication to their mission made negotiation impossible. Between these extremes of chaos and order, the other outer planes developed according to their own principles. Bitopia celebrated industry and honest work, its twin layers rotating around each other in eternal day. The Beastlands preserved nature in its most primal and wild form, home to gods of the hunt and animal spirits. Isgard honored heroism and battle, where warriors fought by day and feasted at night in halls that echoed with eternal celebration. Each plane expressed a different answer to fundamental questions about existence and value. Each attracted souls who resonated with those answers. The mechanisms by which souls found their proper plane after death remained one of the most studied aspects of planar mechanics. When a mortal died, their soul separated from their body and entered the astral plane. Most souls appeared to drift naturally toward the plane that matched their alignment and beliefs. A soul devoted to law and good found itself drawn toward Celestia. A soul steeped in chaos and evil fell toward the abyss. This process seemed automatic, requiring no conscious choice or external guidance. Psychopomps like the Raven Queen could intervene to redirect souls or claim those who fell between standard categories, but most souls found their destinations without assistance. Once arrived in their appropriate plane, souls underwent transformation. The exact nature of this transformation varied by plane. In Celestia, lawful good souls might become Lantern Archons, the lowest rank of celestial beings. Over time and through continued service to good and law, they could ascend through higher forms, eventually becoming powerful Archons if they proved themselves worthy. In the abyss, evil souls were usually transformed into Manes, the weakest form of demon. These wretched creatures served as fodder for the blood war and as prey for more powerful demons. Only the most cunning and ruthless Manes survived long enough to evolve into higher demonic forms. This soul economy created a form of cosmic justice where mortal choices had eternal consequences. Those who dedicated their lives to good found themselves in realms of beauty and virtue. Those who embraced evil ended in places of torment and predation. The system was not perfectly fair. Souls could be deceived about the nature of their actions. Devils specialized in corrupting mortals through careful manipulation, leading victims to damn themselves through apparently reasonable choices. Gods could intervene to claim souls who would otherwise go elsewhere, provided they had a legitimate claim of worship or service. These complications meant that planar destination was not purely deterministic, and the possibility of redemption or damnation remained open until the moment of death. Some mortal souls escaped the standard afterlife entirely. Powerful individuals sometimes became ghosts or other incorporeal undead, their unfinished business binding them to the material or ethereal planes. Others were claimed by extraplanar entities before death, their souls sold or promised through pacts and contracts. Warlocks who swore service to archfey, devils, or other powerful beings often found their afterlife predetermined by their agreements. These contracted souls might serve their patrons in the plane of that patron's choosing, their individual alignment irrelevant compared to the binding nature of their oath. The possibility of preventing or altering the natural soul journey inspired various magical traditions. Necromancy offered the most direct approach, binding souls to undead bodies or trapping them in objects. Lichdom represented the ultimate necromantic achievement, allowing a mortal spellcaster to achieve a form of immortality by transferring their soul into a phylactery while their body transformed into an undead vessel. Liches could exist indefinitely, pursuing magical research and accumulating power across centuries or millennia. The cost was the constant need to feed on mortal souls to sustain the phylactery, turning even originally noble liches toward evil over time. Other magical traditions sought to preserve mortal existence without embracing undeath. The most powerful wizards developed clone spells that could create backup bodies for their souls. Some druids learned to reincarnate, transferring their consciousness into new forms when their current bodies failed. Monks who achieved enlightenment sometimes transcended the need for fixed form entirely, their souls becoming one with the multiverse itself. These techniques required tremendous skill and often failed, sending the experimenter's soul to whatever afterlife awaited them. The risk did not deter those desperate enough to seek immortality or powerful enough to believe they could succeed where others had failed. The planes themselves offered paths to extended or eternal existence that did not require magical transformation. Some mortals accepted service to gods or powerful extraplanar beings in exchange for effective immortality as divine servants or planar agents. These servants retained their mortal consciousness while gaining immortal lifespans and often supernatural powers. The price was absolute loyalty to their patron and the requirement to advance that patron's goals throughout eternity. For those whose values aligned with their patron's nature, this represented an ideal afterlife, combining purpose with eternal existence. For others, it became an unending servitude that differed from damnation only in degree. The most radical approach to escaping standard mortality involved planar migration during life rather than after death. Some mortals established permanent residence in the planes, adapting to their new environment and gradually transforming into natives of their adopted realm. Humans who settled in the Feywild eventually became something other than human, taking on Fey characteristics and immortal lifespans. Those who made homes in the elemental chaos sometimes merged with elemental forces, becoming genasi or even full elementals. These transformations were usually irreversible. A human who had become Fey could not simply return to mortal existence. The planes changed those who dwelt within them permanently. The transformative power of the planes extended beyond individuals to entire civilizations. The Githyanki and Githzerai, descended from human slaves freed from Mind Flayer domination, had split into separate races based on their chosen planar homes. The Githyanki settled in the astral plane, becoming raiders and warriors who valued martial prowess and individual strength. The Githzerai chose the chaos of limbo, learning to impose order on that realm through mental discipline and meditation. Thousands of years of planar residence had made them into distinct species with different philosophies and physical capabilities. They maintained their mutual hatred despite their common origin. Their philosophical differences crystallized into eternal enmity. Similar but less dramatic transformations affected most long-term planar residents. Traders who spent years moving between planes developed an intuitive sense for planar geography that no map could teach. They learned which portals remained stable and which shifted with the seasons or tides of planar politics. They understood the etiquette required when dealing with genies, devils, or celestials. Most importantly, they developed the mental flexibility necessary to navigate different cosmological models and the cultural frameworks of beings whose nature was fundamentally alien to mortal experience. The Planar Consortium emerged as the most powerful mercantile organization spanning multiple planes. Unlike earlier trading companies that focused on specific routes or goods, the consortium operated across the entire multiverse. Its factors established branches in every major planar city and maintained portal networks that bypassed sigils restrictions. The consortium's success derived from its strict neutrality. It traded with devils and demons, celestials and fiends without judging its customers. This neutrality made the consortium indispensable, and also made it targets for groups who believed commerce with evil was itself evil. Celestial militants occasionally raided consortium warehouses in the upper planes, destroying goods they deemed too dangerous for trade. The consortium's influence extended beyond simple commerce into planar politics. When disputes arose between different planes or their inhabitants, consortium mediators often negotiated settlements. Their motive was maintaining stable trade routes rather than justice, but the practical effect was to reduce conflict and promote cooperation across planar boundaries. Some philosophers argued that the consortium had become more important than the factions in determining the actual governance of multiplanar civilization. While factions debated theories of reality's meaning, The consortium quietly established the practical rules that governed daily existence for most planers. Not everyone approved of increased planar interconnection. Isolationist movements developed on various planes, arguing that too much contact between realms diluted their fundamental nature. Some celestials worried that regular interaction with neutral or even evil beings would corrupt the upper planes. Devils recognized that increased trade reduced their ability to maintain information monopolies and control resources. Demons simply attacked anything that represented order or cooperation, viewing the consortium and similar organizations as affronts to chaos. These isolationist tendencies created tension between the forces promoting planar integration and those seeking to maintain boundaries and distinctions. The tension came to a head in several incidents where planar isolation was forcibly imposed. The most dramatic occurred when an Archon faction sealed several portals connecting Celestia to other planes, arguing that evil beings were using these routes to spy on celestial defenses. The portal closures disrupted trade throughout the upper planes and created hardship for mortal petitioners who found themselves unable to receive visitors from their former lives. Eventually, more moderate Archons reopened the portals, but the incident demonstrated how quickly planar politics could shift toward conflict and separation. Similar dynamics played out in miniature across the planes. Local powers closed borders or imposed restrictions on travel. Some planes became effectively inaccessible to mortals without divine sponsorship. Others opened wide, welcoming visitors and immigrants regardless of origin or alignment. The pattern suggested that the planes were experiencing a tension between universalizing forces that promoted integration and particularizing forces that emphasized difference and separation. Neither side appeared to be winning decisively, and the equilibrium shifted constantly based on current events and influential individuals' decisions. Magic itself reflected and shaped these planar dynamics. The development of new spells and magical items changed what was possible in terms of planar travel and interaction. Portable holes and bags of holding, which created pocket dimensions for storage, became common enough that most adventurers carried them. Teleportation circles allowed for instant travel between prepared locations on the same plane. Plane shift and gate spells made interplanar travel accessible to mid-level and high-level spellcasters. Each magical innovation reduced the barriers between planes and increased the rate of cross-planar contact. The democratization of planar travel created new problems that previous ages had not needed to address. Invasive species accidentally transported between planes disrupted local ecologies. Diseases that evolved in one plane's conditions sometimes proved catastrophic when introduced to others. Cultural conflicts erupted when beings with fundamentally incompatible values found themselves living in close proximity. These problems required solutions that ranged from magical quarantine to planar immigration law to outright military intervention when conflicts escalated beyond peaceful resolution. The gods watched these developments with varying degrees of concern and interest. Some deities embraced increased planar integration as beneficial to their goals. Gods whose portfolios included travel, trade, or knowledge supported and often sponsored improved connections between planes. Other gods viewed integration with suspicion, worrying that their followers would be tempted or corrupted by exposure to foreign ideas and beings. The most conservative deities attempted to isolate their faithful, forbidding planar travel and contact with outsiders. These efforts rarely succeeded completely, as mortal curiosity and ambition consistently overcame divine prohibition. Divine politics became increasingly complex as gods competed in an environment where mortal worship could be influenced by forces from across the multiverse. A god who previously enjoyed a monopoly in a particular region might find themselves challenged by deities from other worlds who had established portals and sent missionaries. This created pressure for gods to expand their own planar presence, establishing divine domains and sending their own servants to compete for mortal souls. The result was a kind of divine imperialism where gods sought to expand their influence not through direct conquest but through cultural and religious competition. Some gods took a different approach, forming divine coalitions that spanned traditional pantheon boundaries. These alliances were based on portfolio rather than cultural origin. Gods of war from different worlds sometimes cooperated despite having no prior relationship. Gods of death found common cause regardless of their alignment or the mortal cultures that worshipped them. These trans-pantheon alliances reflected the reality that planar politics increasingly transcended the boundaries of individual crystal spheres and material worlds. The concept of crystal spheres itself came under pressure as planar travel became more common. Traditional cosmology held that each material world existed within a crystal sphere that separated it from the phlogiston, the rainbow ocean between spheres. Spell-jamming ships could travel through the phlogiston to reach other spheres and their contained worlds. This model worked well for material plane travel, but sat awkwardly alongside planar cosmology. Did each crystal sphere have its own set of planes, or did all spheres share the same planar structure? Different schools of thought offered contradictory answers. The most widely accepted theory proposed that the outer planes were truly universal, shared by all crystal spheres and material worlds. The inner planes existed separately for each sphere, explaining why the plane of fire connected to Tauril showed different characteristics from the plane of fire connected to Earth or Kryn. This theory had the advantage of explaining observed phenomena, but it created conceptual problems about the nature of space and connection between realities. If the outer planes were universal, how did distance work for a soul traveling from a material world to its final destination? The astral plane provided a partial answer by operating on principles that ignored physical distance, but the full explanation remained elusive. These cosmological questions moved from academic curiosity to practical urgency as the planes themselves showed signs of fundamental instability. Small tiers in planar boundaries became more common. Regions where the Feywild or Shadowfell overlapped with the material plane expanded and contracted in ways that seemed random. The elemental chaos grew more chaotic, with some primordials achieving levels of wakefulness not seen since the Dawn War. These signs suggested that the multiverse was entering a period of increased volatility, where the stable structures that had persisted for ages might be subject to sudden and dramatic change. Planar scholars debated whether this instability represented a natural cycle or an ominous warning. Some pointed to similar periods in ancient history when the planes had undergone reorganization. They argued that reality periodically required restructuring to accommodate the accumulated changes wrought by divine action, mortal magic, and simple entropy. Others warned that the current instability exceeded historical precedents and might indicate an approaching catastrophe on the scale of the spell plague or worse. Both sides mustered evidence and arguments, but neither could definitively prove their case. The planes themselves remained cryptic, offering no clear indication of whether current conditions represented danger or simply change. In response to uncertainty, various organizations attempted to prepare for multiple possible futures. The Planar Consortium diversified its holdings and established backup facilities in scattered locations across the planes. Sigil's factions increased their vigilance, watching for signs of impending catastrophe while debating what form such a catastrophe might take. The gods reinforced their divine realms and positioned servants to respond quickly to emergencies. Individual adventurers and planar explorers continued their work, sometimes driven by idealism and sometimes by simple greed, mapping unknown corners of the planes and discovering secrets that previous ages had overlooked or deliberately hidden. These explorations revealed that the planes remained vastly larger and more complex than even the most comprehensive cosmological models suggested. New demiplanes continued to form spontaneously or through magical creation. Forgotten layers of existing planes were rediscovered, often containing civilizations or secrets that had been isolated for millennia. The most exciting discoveries involved connections between planes that cosmological theory suggested should not exist. These impossible portals and strange borderlands hinted that planar structure was more fluid and interconnected than standard models acknowledged. One of the most significant discoveries involved the Far Realm, a dimension so alien that it existed outside normal planar categories. The far realm did not fit into either the Great Wheel or World Axis cosmology. It appeared to be something altogether other, a reality operating on principles incompatible with the standard multiverse. Contact with the far realm invariably resulted in madness for mortals and corruption for physical matter. Even gods who attempted to study the far realm found themselves changed in disturbing ways. The revelation that such a place existed and had access points within the normal planes raised profound questions about the nature and boundaries of reality itself. Some scholars suggested that the far realm represented what existed before planar differentiation, the formless chaos that preceded the creation of structure and law. Others proposed that it was a failed multiverse, a reality that had evolved according to different rules and existed alongside the familiar planes in some higher dimensional space. The most disturbing theory held that the far realm was the future, a preview of what all planes would eventually become as entropy and chaos gradually dissolved the organizing principles that currently maintained structure. None of these theories could be proven, and the far realm itself provided no answers, only madness for those foolish enough to seek understanding. The existence of the far realm inspired new caution in planar exploration. Organizations that had previously encouraged aggressive expansion of planar knowledge began implementing restrictions. Certain portals were sealed and guarded. Information about particularly dangerous planes or planar regions was classified and restricted to those with legitimate need to know. These restrictions created friction with those who believed knowledge should be freely shared, but the consequences of unrestricted far realm contact provided compelling justification for caution. A single contaminated explorer returning from the far realm could corrupt an entire city if not properly quarantined and treated. Despite such dangers, planar exploration continued because the rewards remained significant. Each newly discovered plane or planar region offered resources, knowledge, or strategic advantages. Rare materials found only in specific planes commanded extraordinary prices. Spells and magical techniques unique to particular planar traditions granted their possessors significant advantages. Alliances with powerful planar beings provided both protection and opportunities for advancement. These incentives ensured that there would always be individuals willing to risk the dangers of the planes in pursuit of glory or profit. The relationship between risk and reward in planar exploration mirrored the broader themes that defined the planes themselves. The planes were fundamentally about extremes and absolutes. The upper planes represented goodness taken to its logical conclusion. The lower planes embodied evil in its purest forms. The inner planes expressed elemental forces without compromise or mitigation. The outer planes in general manifested philosophical principles as physical reality. This clarity made the planes simultaneously dangerous and attractive. One always knew where one stood in the planes, in a way that the morally ambiguous material plane rarely provided. This moral and philosophical clarity created the final defining characteristic of planar existence. The planes were not neutral spaces where different value systems competed on equal terms. They were partisan, aligned, committed to particular visions of what reality should be. A celestial did not simply prefer good over evil. Goodness defined their fundamental nature, shaped every aspect of their existence, and determined their eternal purpose. A devil did not merely practice evil. Evil was the substance of their being, the organizing principle of their consciousness. This absolutism meant that the planes could never achieve permanent peace or equilibrium. As long as opposed principles existed in physical form, conflict between planes was inevitable. Yet that same conflict also provided stability. The blood war consumed the energies of the lower planes. Celestial fiend conflicts occupied the forces of both upper and lower planes. Elemental opposition between fire and water, earth and air, prevented any single element from achieving dominance. The gods competed for worship, but also cooperated to maintain the systems that allowed their competition to continue. The Lady of Pain enforced neutrality and sigil, providing space for negotiation and commerce. These checks and balances had preserved the multiverse through ages of cosmic conflict. They represented the accumulated wisdom of countless civilizations about how to manage opposed absolutes without triggering mutual destruction. The modern era found the planes in a state of dynamic equilibrium. Trade and travel connected once isolated realms. Organizations like the Planar Consortium facilitated cooperation across boundaries that had previously been absolute. Factions debated the meaning and structure of reality, while merchants and adventurers pursued more practical goals. Gods competed for mortal worship while maintaining the rules that made such competition sustainable. Devils and demons continued their eternal war. Celestials opposed evil wherever they encountered it. Elementals expressed their natures without concern for mortal or divine politics. Through all this activity, the planes themselves endured, vast and ancient, shaped by their inhabitants, but also shaping those who dwelt within their boundaries. The planes remained the connective tissue of the multiverse, linking material worlds to each other and to the cosmic forces that gave them meaning. Every prayer, every spell, every act of heroism or villainy sent ripples through the planes. Every soul that completed its mortal existence began a new journey through planar afterlife. Every portal opened, every summoning completed, every planar trade contract signed strengthened the bonds between realms. The planes were not simply settings for adventure or abstract philosophical constructs. They were living systems, complex and interconnected, where the fundamental questions of existence received not theoretical answers but actual physical manifestation. Looking forward, the planes seemed poised between multiple possible futures. Increased integration could lead to a truly universal planar civilization spanning all realms. Alternatively, isolationist pressures might reassert themselves, fragmenting the multiverse into separated domains with minimal contact. New catastrophes comparable to the Spell Plague might reorganize planar structure yet again. The Far Realm and other external threats could intrude more severely into normal planar space. Or equilibrium might persist indefinitely, maintaining current patterns for ages to come. The planes had survived every previous crisis and transformation. Their fundamental nature transcended any particular configuration or organizational principle. What remained constant across all possible futures was the significance of the planes to mortal existence. The planes would continue to provide destinations for souls after death. They would remain sources of magical power and divine intervention. They would offer opportunities for adventure and discovery to those brave or foolish enough to cross planar boundaries. They would embody in physical form the moral and philosophical principles that gave meaning to mortal choices. As long as mortals continued to question the nature of reality, to seek purpose beyond mere survival, to imagine realms of perfect justice or ultimate evil, the planes would exist to answer those questions and make those imaginations real. The planes were not destinations separate from mortal concerns, but extensions of the deepest hopes and fears that defined mortal consciousness itself. They were the multiverse made manifest. Infinity expressed in forms that finite minds could comprehend and navigate. Eternity made accessible to those who dared to step beyond the familiar world and embrace the vast strangeness that waited beyond.